Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first CUGC Connect webinar of 2022. Yay! I'm so happy to have Rimo3 with us today. They are a first-time webinar presenter with CUGC, and they're also a new CUGC global sponsor. So thank you for supporting the community. Glad to have you on. Before we get started, I just have a couple of beginning slides for us. Obviously, we're here to talk about application delivery strategies, and I think you're going to hear and see lots of great information today, so I'm not going to take up too much time here. But I do want to let you know we are recording today's webinar. You'll get a link to the recording tomorrow. That email is going to come directly from GoToWebinar, just like your registration information did, so be on the lookout for that. Also, we'd love to take your questions today, as many as we can, so put those in the chat. We'll ask some of them out loud, and then some of them may get answered in the chat, but definitely type those in as you have them, and we'll get to as many as we can. And okay, I'm just to introduce who's with us today. We have Samit Halvadia. He is the CTO of Rimo3. Welcome, Samit.
Thanks. I'm very excited to be here, Stephanie.
We're glad to have you. Also with us, we have Steve Noel. He's a CTA, and he's part of our Madison CUGC group. He's going to keep an eye on all the questions that you're putting in and help get them to the right place to get answered. So welcome, Steve.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me. Don't be shy.
All right, well, I'm going to turn things directly over to you, Samit. I'm going to send you the screen right now. 1 second, here it comes.
Fantastic.
All right, and then I'm going to disappear for a little bit, and I'll be back a little later when we wrap up.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephanie. So I am very excited to be here in front of the CUCG. I have spent quite a bit of time during my tenure. I can't see who's on the call, so I may or may not know you. But for those of you that I don't know, I am Samit Halvadia. I'm CTO here at Rimo3. But for the past 2 decades, I've been knocking around in the EUC space, specifically focused on application management. So really started my career at Install Shield as product manager for Install Shield and Admin Studio. For those of you that might remember packaging and repackaging and all that fun stuff. And then eventually made my way to AppDNA, where I'd started the North American business with Mike Welling. And then ultimately ended up at Citrix via way of acquisition, and spent 8 years there in a variety of different roles, most recently running worldwide pre-sales strategy. So enjoyed working for Hector during that time, and one of the things that I learned and that kind of compelled me to leave Citrix and go back to the startup world was the lack of investment in application preparation, application testing, just kind of letting AppDNA become deprecated. Where in 2009, when we first started, it was groundbreaking static analysis unattended testing. People thought that the application problem was gone. And then when we started looking at Citrix Cloud, we started looking at AVD, we started looking at Amazon workspaces, and people starting to think about how they wanted to start migrating to those new platforms, or even just exploring those new platforms. It became very, very apparent that the application problem wasn't gone. So I linked back up with Mike Welling, the founder of AppDNA, and here we are at Rimo3 with a bunch of folks from the AppDNA team, as well as a leadership team from FS Logics has joined us as well. So it's very exciting to kind of see these two types of technologies come together, these two types of organizations, and the mindsets around how we can address some of the difficult problems that are out there today. So if I put it, I'm not going to give you guys the sales pitch, because that's just not my jam. But really what we do is we focus on allowing you to test your applications in bulk, completely unattended, so that you can deploy those applications securely to your Citrix workspace, to your AVD workspace, to your VMware workspace, regardless of what workspace you want to deploy to, if it's physical, if it's virtual, or even if it's a cloud-based DaaS offering. We have the ability to take your existing application portfolio and help you understand through automated testing. I'll get into more detail around how we do that because it's a huge departure from the traditional static analysis that we talked about, and get those applications into your desired workspaces. So right now you'll see our main technology partners fall into one of two categories today. One of them is folks that deliver workspaces like Microsoft and Citrix and VMware. And then the second category is kind of the management planes themselves, right? So Spot PC by NetApp, right? You look at Nerdio and you look at some of these other management planes that have come out to help people more effectively manage their cloud DaaS environments and some hybrid environments. So for us, that's been a really interesting kind of space for us to start saying, oh, Spot PC came to us and said, by the way, we're managing Windows 365 environments. Can you help us test applications as part of the pre-deployment process? So we're starting to see new use cases kind of spawn on a regular basis around where we traditionally play with the automated testing versus where we are starting to get into the management plane around application management and ongoing change management. So for us, it's actually been kind of a, hey, we always just thought that we'd test for workspaces, but this management plane thing has become quite interesting for us. And then, of course, we have our traditional services partners. Everything that we do, we don't have our own professional services organizations. We are very partner-centric. We are very partner-led. So the likes of Incentra and ProArc, Cortex, Integra, these are all names that you'll all know and love. And we work closely with them to actually build our offering into their service line offerings, so they have the ability to more efficiently manage change and endpoints for our customers. So really quickly, when I joined and we started thinking about where people are going around DaaS, right? We started in 2019 is when we founded Rimo, and we started thinking about the fact that, holy cow, people are starting to move to DaaS, and then obviously the pandemic hit. And we started seeing people move more and more workloads, or attempt to move more and more workloads into DaaS offerings. Azure Virtual Desktop was a hot topic, Windows 365, Google Workspace, Citrix Cloud working with kind of some of these technologies and then managing the on-prem component. We started seeing some exploratory conversations start happening, and what it turned into was perpetual tire kicking. And what I mean by that is people would pick 25 folks from their organization and say, all right, we're moving you to AVD. And then they'd say, great, now let me deploy Office 365, let me deploy Teams and Adobe. And then that would stop, right? You'd just be in a perpetual 3-app proof of concept, because they didn't know which applications or which users, the same traditional problems we've experienced in our VDI space. Without user segmentation and without application segmentation, there was no concrete plan of how to move forward. So the perpetual tire kicking, it's still happening today because there's not the data that they need to start making the informed decisions on how to move forward and which applications and users to prioritize. But then conversely, we started seeing that, while we were initially focused very much on these cloud-based DaaS offerings and migrations and testing applications for that space, one of the bigger challenges was actually, I have my on-prem environment and I'm dealing with cumulative updates on a monthly basis. I'm dealing with changes coming from my security profiles on a regular basis. I am changing my application portfolio on a regular basis. And my on-prem and hybrid infrastructure also needed the same type of TLC that we were trying to give for these big bang migrations to the cloud. And what we found is that between the security updates, cumulative updates, and Windows, there was still a huge amount of value in managing some of the change that was happening on a daily, monthly, or annual or biannual or an annual basis with the feature pack releases. So all of a sudden, what we ended up finding out almost by happenstance was that while we were focused on helping people prepare for change tomorrow, there was a massive opportunity for us to take folks that were having T plus 45 day patch testing cycles and cumulative update cycles, which means that another cumulative update's already been released, and get that down to T plus 3 days by leveraging automated testing, right? And giving you that sense of confidence. Now, I don't need to tell you guys what the impact of deploying changes without planning and testing look like. Now, it might not be as catastrophic as it once was, so I'll be the first one to raise my hand and say that, right? When we started thinking about the old days of moving from Windows XP, deprecating 16-bit, moving from 32-bit and exploring 64-bit, getting to Windows 7, there were real compatibility issues that were happening at, a 40% clip. What we've seen at this point is, even from a server compatibility standpoint, we're usually looking at, maybe 15 to 20%, but it's not so much about the compatibility. It's more so about the degradation and compromised user experience. So sure, you're going to have system downtime, loss of productivity. We've heard that song and dance for ages. But what we've started seeing is that people are getting more and more upset, especially as they're working from home, around a compromised user experience, right? We're not Lakeside, we're not digital experience monitoring, but what we are, and I'll show you kind of in the demo, is that we're able to answer a couple of questions. The first one will be, is this application something I can install? The second is this something that will actually function and execute in my desired workspace? And the third is, will it function and execute as well as it does today in my current workspace? And for us, what we started finding is that people were less worried about necessarily the loss of productivity, but more so about the fact that they didn't have the time and the resources necessary to spend days and hours troubleshooting these issues. They didn't have a way to quantify what a compromised user experience would look like prior to deploying an application or prior to deploying a change. And that's where we started seeing our traction, and that's where we started seeing success. I still see a huge amount of value for us as we kind of look forward and start thinking about the fact that there will be a transition towards DAS, but the reality is there's a ton of work to be done today as it pertains to just managing and coping with the pace of change. So I was talking to Lori Beers, who's the CIO over at JPMC, and she told me, I asked her what were her initiatives last year. And obviously everything is very security related, but she said that their IT department is really going to focus on becoming much more of a technology company. So what do you mean by that? She's like, well, I want to have a CTO sitting in every line of business that sits with IT, because the change that we're going through right now, the pace of change is accelerating. And without automation, we're not going to be able to cope with that change. And the resources are just too lean for us to be able to cope with that change. And then she exacerbated that by saying, on top of that, we're going to end up in a situation where it's great, where initially, if you have an issue that happens, and during Citrix, I've had a couple of failures on my machine, all I would do is go down to the cafeteria of 951, go give my laptop, get a little bit of lunch, and then my laptop would be ready by the time I was done eating lunch. That's not the case anymore, right? So I worked very closely with Dell Managed Services on a large aerospace defense, we'll call them, customer. And one of the things that they started doing was they started saying, well, we just don't have the resources. So for cumulative updates, we're going to do deployment rings, and we're going to do 4 deployment rings, and that's the end of it. We're going to hope for the best and prepare for the worst. But now that you can't go into the office, we ended up in a situation where, because it was a secure environment, in April of 2020, they rolled out a patch, a cumulative update for May. And those users 20,000 end users were impacted by that particular update because they did a deployment ring. The first one went well, the second one went well, the third one not so well. And what ended up happening is what would typically be 2 hours of waiting to get your machine completely restored. They actually had to physically ship these machines to an undisclosed location. Took between 3 and 4 days depending on the queue because the resources were so constrained. And really you lost basically 80,000 person days of productivity waiting for these types of issues to be resolved. Now, this is an extreme catastrophic example in my opinion, but the reality is there's still a regular amount of disruptive change. And the fact that it's more impactful now that people are remote makes it even more important to do the right thing up front, get the data up front, and start making decisions on whether to postpone an update or whether to retire an application or get a new version of the application or make a change to your GPO setting that will allow you to ensure that you don't lose any productivity. So I'm going to take a quick pause right there. I see this thing blinking in the chat. Are there any questions right now? No.
None yet. I imagine there'll be some more as we get into the weeds a little bit.
Perfect. Let me just make sure I go back to the screen. Sorry. All right. So when we start thinking about patches specifically, right? I mean, this is one thing that that I've been pretty adamant about, and we actually did a pretty good job when we built out some of the professional services offerings inside of Citrix to focus on some of the patch management. In fact, I think Richard Cortez still runs a big chunk of that business from a managed service perspective inside of Citrix to help with exactly this problem. Because what we started seeing, and this is an interesting point, you know, we started seeing more and more breaches, so we started seeing more and more patches. And every time we end up with these cumulative updates that are a subset of KBs that are already meant to fix things, if you're dealing with a T plus 45 day cycle to actually deploy those applications, you know, when they publish the vulnerabilities that have been addressed, that's where we start seeing the most breaches happen, right? Because of the fact that, you know, you've got folks focusing on you know, trying to exploit those vulnerabilities for folks that won't patch their systems quickly enough. And it's really, really kind of a shocking thing because I read this for the first time with another analyst when we were talking about patching and the importance of having automation as part of the good patch management policy to get it down to 3 to 5 days is what I'd consider acceptable. And what he ended up telling me was that ultimately, just so you're aware, if you go through the process of going back as a retrospective and looking at all of the vulnerabilities over the last from 2019 to now, at the time of these attacks, patches were available for every single vulnerability. And that completely blew my mind, right? Like if you just applied them faster, if you were just more efficient and ensured that that your environment was secure, without disrupting your productivity, without breaking any applications, without having to ship laptops back to an undisclosed location, you end up in a situation where you could have avoided a lot of these issues. So when we start thinking about change, patch is just an example of it, right? So from my perspective, the important thing that we need to focus on is that every enterprise operating environment is unique. And that's what makes these, enterprises special, right? There's nothing that comes commercial off the shelf. Every single OS inside of most organizations and enterprises, and even CAM accounts, right? They tend to have a lot of customization done to them on a regular basis from their workspaces, right? I've talked to folks that have upwards of 25 gold images, folks that have even more than that, right? People that are constantly updating those gold images on a quarterly basis, patches that are happening on a weekly basis. You think about cumulative updates happening on a monthly basis and GPOs being reviewed every single quarter, new versions of Windows coming out every 6 months, build configurations being looked at every 6 months, and security profiles being looked at every time there's a vulnerability. Just the permutation of all those changes that are happening to the operating environment that's being delivered to your end users ends up becoming almost unmanageable, right? You're looking at theoretically 15 changes, 20 changes in a single month, and you're expected to keep up with this without necessarily disrupting the end user, without bringing them in to constantly have to test these applications. Now you compound that by saying, great, that's my workspace that's being updated on a regular basis, that's being changed and configured on a regular basis. But from an applications perspective, the same type of thing is happening, right? You're running into new versions of the application happening however often, right? If it's a desktop-based application, it'll be less frequent than something that's more of a hybrid application that has a desktop client and a SaaS component as well. Patches for applications that are happening on a regular basis. The churn, right? Being able to go through and say, I'm ready for a new version of this application because this last one is unsupported on my latest OS. Changing the package formats, right? This is still, believe it or not, a thing. MSI, MSIX, I want to take advantage of app attach, I want to take advantage of app volumes, I want to look at new different app layering technologies. Each one of those changes that you make to the application format impacts the functionality and performance of that application, especially depending on where you're delivering it to and how you're delivering it. And then you add the customizations alongside of that, the transforms, the custom actions, the scripts, the wrappers, the PowerShell deploy, instructions that go alongside that, you end up with quite a bit of uniqueness, to say the least. So when you look at something like a static analysis approach, or you look at a manual approach, this is something that's very, very difficult to be able to manage, right? I mean, you stay with that term, and I'll remember her term, you have to cope with that change. And what we want you to do is start thinking about leveraging automation to really kind of help you embrace that change. And what I mean by that is you start looking at application delivery today, there's nobody that I know of that has a homogeneous environment. Everything is heterogeneous. And what I mean by that is that you have a bit of hybrid infrastructure, you have a bit of on-prem, you have a bit of cloud, you have a bit of DaaS, you have a bit of, whatever different deployment methodologies you want to use. But the reality is the same application might end up being deployed in 8 different ways, to 8 different workspaces, to 12 different images. And when you start thinking about how am I supposed to be able to test against all these different theoretical deployment and delivery strategies, it can be quite overwhelming. So that's where I'm going to introduce Rimo3, right? So when you're dealing with Windows-based applications and you have a variety of different deployment methodologies, right? So for here, I'll use an example of here's a real customer that's trying to use and consolidate their way to a couple of deployment methodologies. They're exploring AVD because they love multi-session, they love MSIX, not really MSIX, they love app attach. They also have a CVAD environment that they're moving from 2012 to 2019. And at the same time, you might as well look at Windows. This is a daunting thing when you're dealing with 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 applications in their portfolio. Do I really want to test against each and every one of those builds? Do I have a subject matter expert that's willing to put their butt in the seat and actually test these applications for 4 hours to see whether or not it'll work in each of those operating environments? And the reality is most people don't. They have to do their day job. IT is not necessarily a subject matter expert in the applications. They don't necessarily know how to test those applications properly, nor is it their job, right? With Rimo3, what we do is we leverage our intelligent smoke test and allow you to test against multiple different operating environments by using dynamic analysis. So here, what we have the ability to do is through our automated testing platform, we're actually going to install the application in your desired workspace. We're going to execute the application in your desired workspace. We're going to click through the application in your desired workspace. We're going to measure the performance in that desired workspace and ultimately give you the data that you need to make a decision of should I deploy this in my desired workspace or workspaces. So with that, I'll just give you, let me skip this case study. I'll go into the actual demo on the platform itself. So you have two ways to deploy. Hopefully everyone can see that. You have two options around how to deploy Rimo3. You can do it hybrid, so it's sitting inside of your infrastructure, or you could do it and consume it completely cloud-based. But for us, when we start thinking about what the process should look like to start preparing for managing change through automated testing, you have the ability to quickly answer a questionnaire. You go through, you get started. What would I like to do today? I want to check my migration suitability for Citrix today. So I want to look at my server-based computing environment, and I want to see if I can move it from, let's call it 2012 R2. Now, of course, if you have your own private builds, you have the ability to actually integrate with your Azure tenant, or you have the ability to point to them inside of your infrastructure so that we will be testing against them. Now, the reason that the current OS is important, guys, is because of the fact that we need to have a baseline. This is kind of our normalization process of ensuring that you give me an application in a known environment that you already know is in production and that works, and we will execute it so that we can see what that predicted behavior looks like. So if you tell me it's good, we're going to execute it and see that it's good. And that gives us the baseline to actually go ahead and say, for my desired target OS, I might want to move to something like Server 2022. And then off you go. Now, once that's done, what you'll see is you'll see a dashboard where we can come in and take a look at what's happened through the overall testing process. So what you'll see here, and this will obviously take time, this is kind of the Julia Childs portion of this, where I've already pre-baked this environment, but to run these 63 applications through, it took about 2 hours to run those applications through the testing process, because we actually spin up the VM, we actually execute and install the application in the VM, then we spin it down and then do it again and again and again. So the interesting thing that we'll be able to see right off the bat is that we saw that actually of my applications that are out there today, 81% of them will be fine. So 19% of them actually will fail. So let's take a look at why something will fail or why something even passed. When we do that, I want to actually take you into what we did as part of the execution of this. So let me take a look at an interesting application. Look at Nitro Pro. So we took this MSI, and this is the process, right? We go through, we execute the application. So we provision the VM first off. Once we provision the VM, you'll see that we actually tested it against Server 2022, 64-bit operating system, right? We install the application. So the one thing to keep in mind is most of these applications that are being managed through Config Manager or whatever management physical endpoint management technology you're using, even if they're not MSIs, they're executables or they're PowerShell deploy, whatever, they are typically silently delivered and silently installed to the end user workspaces. That's the only thing that we need. Because again, for us to make it completely unattended, it does have to be a silent installation or have silent installation switches. So what we'll do is we'll provision our task runner in your environment that you want to test against. Then we'll actually silently install that package. And then we go through the process of smoke testing it. And what does the smoke test mean? So we have 3 patents, 2 are pending, 1's already been approved for our intelligent smoke test. Now, when we started thinking about this, static analysis wasn't enough. And then we started looking at, well, maybe RPA is the way to go. And the reality is, when we started exploring that RPA route, it just didn't scale. It was too difficult to know what every application sequence needed to look like to test an application. So what we did was we actually took a slightly different approach where we said, let's just assume that we don't know what any application is going to do, period, right? We're just going to say, I know it's going to install. We're going to understand all the executables that have been laid down. We know we need to test all of them. But let's not assume that Chrome.msi is a browser and we're going to open a new tab. Instead, what we did was, let's actually execute each one of the executables inside of that business, inside of the application. And from there, we'll look at the dialog box that pops up. And we'll say, what click is most likely to continue the execution of that application? So what can I do from that parent process to spawn as many children processes as possible? And then you'll see it'll actually go through and find single buttons and try to click them so that we will continue executing the application and capturing data. Now, we actually create a video so that you can see exactly what's been clicked through. And again, this is a lightweight test. I mean, it's 60 seconds, maybe a minute. You can run it for up to 3 minutes. But what you're able to do is grab a screen capture of the things that happened during the test and a video of the things that happened during the test, and then ultimately start making decisions on whether or not you think that that was a pass or a fail, right? Including all of the data that we capture around the utilization from a CPU perspective, from a memory perspective, from a disk, and network perspective. So this one ran for, I don't know, a little less, a minute and 15 seconds. But what we were able to find is that, we went through a series of 5 clicks for this particular application, determined that they were all responsive, and then uninstalled that application, deprovisioned the task runner, and off you went to the next application, right? The entire process for this application was 8 minutes to get this data. Now, you can multi-thread this and have as many task runners as you want for the cost of compute, but ultimately, the process that we've kind of put in place here is so that you don't have to have human capital working on this. As I mentioned, teams are running extremely lean. Let the folks focus on innovation, and let's automate the mundane here. So from a testing perspective, we were able to test all of these applications, and this was a major migration, right? 2012 to 2022. But the reality is not everything's going to be a major migration. Some of it'll just be a cumulative update. Again, it's the same overall process, right? You go through and you change what OS you want to test against. And I'll give you an example. I have a video demo as well that I'll show you of us testing one cumulative update versus another cumulative update. Now, on top of just understanding the migration suitability, one of the other things that we've started seeing is that as people, especially in a Citrix environment or in an AVD environment, want to take advantage of some of the cornerstone features like MSIX, for instance, or multi-session capability, this is a new test that most people didn't necessarily have to think of, especially from a desktop or a Windows 10 perspective. That was never a test that people cared about. In the Citrix world, it absolutely was. So what we've done is we've actually taken the smoke test and extended its capabilities to help you determine if an application can run in a multi-session, is capable of running in a multi-session environment. And the way that we do that is pretty straightforward, right? We go through, we actually execute the application, same exact thing. So you'll see it all comes down to the smoke test. We provision the task runner, we install it, and then we start launching multiple sessions to ensure that that application is able to start up concurrently, execute concurrently, and then we grab the performance metrics around that as well. Now, my next goal ultimately is to ensure that, right now it's just telling you whether you can or can't run an application as a multi-session application. Eventually, I want to get to the point where we can say, is this application multi-session friendly? Should it be deployed as a multi-session application in a Windows 10 AVD environment? Or is it ultimately to the point where we can get to additional testing to figure out what user density looks like for that application before you start seeing degradation in performance? Now, the multi-session bit was extremely exciting for a lot of our Citrix customers, as well as for a lot of our AVD prospects that were looking to say, okay, great, help me figure out what the best way to deploy this application looks like. And then at the same time, if you have the ability to look for MSIX as well, it's just a no-brainer, right? Because the approach that we take around MSIX is the same thing that we do with everything else. It's unattended, it's automated. We look and we see whether an application is a good candidate for MSIX. We convert the application into MSIX, and then we test the MSIX itself to see whether or not it's a functional MSIX. So again, now the migration that we're talking about to eventually adopt app attach becomes a lot less painful. Because I can tell you, coming from the packaging world, packaging to a new file format, even when it was AppV, when Citrix had Tarpin, when there was ThinApp, there was a variety of these different technologies around virtualization. Every time you have to learn a new packaging technology, every time you have to learn a new sequencing technology, sometimes people just don't adopt it because the benefits don't outweigh the efforts. And MSIX is a fairly immature technology at the moment. I think over time, when it's able to support Windows services, when it's able to support drivers, lower level components of an application, I think it's going to be a great piece of technology because honestly, the fact that it's somewhat containerized, the fact that there's a completely clean uninstall, so it doesn't contribute to Windows rot like traditional application file formats do, because of the file redirection and the registry redirection and the read-write protection. There's quite a bit that I think MSIX can provide as more and more applications become suitable for it. But the reality is, in today's day and age, we're not seeing a ton of adoption around that. I'd be interested to see if you guys hear anything differently. But Stephanie, if you wouldn't mind, this would be a great time to put up the two polls, one around AVD and the one around Windows 365, because when we start thinking about what that migration plan looks like for 12 months, I feel like we're in a situation where we're moving ever so slowly away from perpetual tire kicking to at least 2 to 3 lines of businesses inside of organizations starting to adopt these new technologies. Sorry, Stephanie. Does this mean that my screen's not being shared right now during the poll?
Yeah, the poll takes over the screen.
All good.
Yeah, so we'll give it just a couple more seconds and then I'll kick off the other one. But I'll
No,
share
that's
the
perfect.
results first.
Listen, your guys' data is more important to me than hearing me say words, so I'm happy for that. I think the other piece, just to kind of keep in mind as we talk through this, is that there is no linear journey anymore. It's not I'm moving from Windows XP to Windows 7. It's I have 5 different ways to deploy an application, which means I have 5 different workspaces to manage change on, which means I have 5 different tests that need to be run on a regular basis to ensure that there's nothing disruptive to the business. From the perspective of MSIX, by the way, one of the other things I should point out is that, as part of the overall migration process, more and more people that I'm talking to from a customer perspective that are looking at AVD kind of want to bypass MSIX and just take advantage of app attach, which is not possible. But ultimately, what we're seeing is that it's a means to an end. For Citrix environments, it might be a little bit different, but the reality is for VMware environments, it could be different. But from a AVD specifically, people want to take advantage of app attach, and that I don't blame them. I mean, it's a great piece of technology, and ultimately, you have a couple of FS Logics guys on the phone as well. So it's good to see that that technology is being adopted. Stephanie, did you do both polls?
Yeah, and I can just tell you the results really quickly. So for the Windows 365 question, it was 60% yes and 40% no. And
Okay.
for AVD, it was flip-flopped. It was 33 yes and 67% no.
And that's so interesting, right? Because I mean, AVD was meant to be an enterprise-centric product. Windows for 365 was meant to be a persistent. You know, you don't worry about multi-session. You don't worry about some of those other components. But you have enterprises that are very excited about Windows 365 because of the simplicity and the low-touch nature of it. You don't have that management overhead of having to ensure that you are coupling costs tightly. You know, it's a predictive licensing model. So that's interesting. Just out of curiosity, Stephanie, would you mind throwing up the Windows 11 one as well?
Sure. Let me find it. Here we go.
Fantastic. So we've usually, you know, having been in this space for some time, one of the things that that I've noticed is that people tend to wait till the last second when it comes to major OS migrations, which I thought that Microsoft did a good job of kind of addressing that with 6-month feature pack update releases, so they weren't as forklift centric as the traditional OS to OS migration had been. But I've started hearing people come back and say, we're looking at Windows 11. And I was really surprised by that because there's still a lot of runway left on Windows 10, and you know, some of the newer builds that are coming out, like the 21 H2 has got a long shelf life still. So the fact that people are looking at Windows 11, that was a bit surprising to me. Do you have the results, Stephanie, for this one too?
Yes. Even split, 50-50.
50-50. Wow. At 3 years and people are still looking at it. That's good. Perfect. So one of the things that I did want to show as well, if there's no questions yet, I will share my screen and pull up the video. So what I'll share here is kind of, this is a preview build on one of our servers, but when we started thinking about, okay, great, you know, change today versus change tomorrow, how can I see that through a single lens? And because all we're doing is leveraging compute and our automation to do the testing, we thought, you know what? There's no reason we can't do this simultaneously. So what I started thinking about is if I wanted to test my OS updates and I'm already spun up my environments, it makes sense for me to say, I'm going to go and think about my existing different builds. So here's where that contextual relevance comes in. I'm going to go into my production build of finance, Windows 10. It's the first half 2021 September CU, and I want to test it against my sandbox build that I built with my October CU as part of it. But why stop there? I might as well say, I'm going to look at my October finance 2004 build that's sitting up in AVD. I want to look at whether or not this is going to be an MSIX friendly group of applications to test against my October finance build that's sitting up in AVD. And I might as well look at my preview Windows 11 build. So if I'm able to come in here and start testing against 5, 6 different, I mean, I'm going to test against my AVD environment as well for Windows 11. If I'm able to go through and pick my applications and all of the different workspaces that I've already created in my environment, I now have the ability to go through, click the submit button, walk away for a couple of days, not have to check back in, come back in, and you're going to get some really, really interesting results around whether your applications can work in each and every one of those environments. So now what you've done is in a single report, You've looked at your tactical operational change that you needed to test for today, which was my cumulative update. I have to get that out quickly, so I'm going to check on that and make sure that it works from September to October. I've already checked on the fact that, okay, I also want to look at my AVD environment, but let me take it one step further and look at my Windows 11 environment. And the nice thing about this is when you start thinking about all of the different data points that you've collected, it's all sitting up there in your database. So you can start extracting this and manipulating it through Power BI in any way that you see fit, right? So you look at a single application. This is a call center application, and we ran it against Windows 10 sitting up in AVD for 2004. We're still able to gather all these metrics, and we gathered them for 5 different workspaces. And that's something that we were able to do, again, without any human intervention. Now, I'm going to caveat this and say that this is great for an intelligent smoke test, but there still needs to be, for your most business critical applications, a component of user acceptance testing. So if you've created RPA scripts, if you've done the work around actually building them out, we have the ability to orchestrate those RPA scripts as well. So that doesn't go to waste. Or if you still need some additional user acceptance testing, you have the ability to do so, but at least now you're starting in a position of power, a position of data. And as part of that extraction, what we have the ability to do is take a report and just generate it right out of the platform. Pull that up. Where you get your jump-started analysis, is what we call it. You come in, you get your application breakdown, but all of those different, let me give you so all of those different workspaces that I tested against, so app by app, my production finance, this was the performance overall. Obviously, the lower the number, the better it is, right? Might not be obvious, but that's the way that we're looking at it, right? We have your network, your memory, we've weighted it, your CPU, but ultimately now you can see that this application will work. This is an older report, so you don't see the multi-session as pending, but here you're able to go back and say with confidence, the best build would be my October 2004 finance build that's sitting up on AVD, but guess what? I can deploy this in any of those environments. Again, this baseline is so important because that's what allows us to take kind of that normalization to start measuring all the rest of those workspaces against. And you do this on an application by application basis, where here you'll see that this particular application, it didn't work great in my production environment. But when I move it to something like my preview Windows 11 as an MSIX, oh my gosh, it performs heads and shoulders above. And having this level of data through automation, that's what gives us the power to say, hey, we focus on change today as well as change tomorrow. So with that, I mean, I know we have 10 minutes left, but I wanted to pause and see if there's any questions, if there's any comments. Now would be a good time. That's all I have to show for the demo.
You just kind of talked about some of this, but just to be crystal clear for the audience here, can we just talk a little bit more about the supporting custom OSs and what that might look like for people that have golden images on-prem or maybe images that they've uploaded to the cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you saw in the dropdown, you have the ability to configure your operating environment. So let's say you took something from the Azure Marketplace or shared image gallery, you've done your customizations to it, and then you've gone ahead and put it in your private image gallery. You'd have the ability to point the task runner directly to that environment and test against that. So you get your GPOs, your settings, your patches, your gold image, your applications that are already installed on there, and test against that. Because our goal ultimately is to ensure that your version of your application works against your version of your build of your workspace. The generic stuff, that was the old way of doing things. ACT, if you remember, the application compatibility toolkit, they have commercial off-the-shelf applications, but nobody ever deploys anything off the shelf. Everyone does their customization. So the contextual relevance is our major value proposition. It's really focused on the fact that we get your OSs, we hook our task runner into them, we get your applications, we test your versions of your applications against your versions of your workspace. And that's how we're able to get such specific data to say that, you know, you can deploy with confidence in your environment, right? This is one of the things that when we talk to Microsoft, they're most excited about, because of the fact that today they have a variety of different tooling available, but the reality is it's all focused on commercial off-the-shelf applications. It's all focused on vanilla builds. You know, you see metrics like, you know, Microsoft notices that there's a 95% compatibility rate of from one feature pack to another feature pack of Windows, and I'd say it's even higher, right? If you're using a vanilla OS with a vanilla version of an application, that's not a problem. But the reality is, when you look at unique versions of applications with unique builds of Windows, you're looking at 15 to 20%.
Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. Another one's coming in for, can test scripts be customized at all?
So the intelligent smoke test, the answer is no, right? That's our proprietary technology, and we go through and test every single application through the same type of cadence and sequence. However, as I mentioned earlier, we do have the ability to allow you to put your own test scripts and orchestrate that inside of the task runner, inside of your image. So if you've taken the time to build your own RAN or X scripting, or you've created a PowerShell script or a test script and things like that, we do have the ability to orchestrate that as well. So we can have the task runner, which is basically our clever guy that's sitting in your Windows environment, execute whatever script that you've pointed it to.
Thank you. And what criteria are you using to determine if an app is MSIX compatible?
Yeah, good question. So we have a couple of things that we do. First, we ensure that it follows Microsoft's suggested guidelines, right? So font packs, things that are missing executables, things that that have device drivers, things that interact with Windows services. We weed those out and tell you that that's not a good candidate for MSIX, just based on the supportability from Microsoft. Once we've actually done that, we go through the process of converting the application, leveraging the Microsoft command line interface conversion utility, but then we take our capabilities around automated remediation for those packages, things that are simple like file redirection, changing the working directory, and some of those other bits, and say, okay, great, we're applying those changes, and then ultimately we give you the MSIX package itself. It's created, we test it the same way we would anything else, and then if it passes, we give you the ability to download it, and you have to re-sign your own cert, and off you go.
Perfect. Another one in for, can Rimo3 help with any usage in a disaster recovery scenario?
I'm not sure I understand the context of that question.
I don't fully either. I'll move on to, if you want to rephrase that for us, please do so. But is there any API mechanism where maybe you want to automate the scheduling of jobs, or a new golden image pops out and you want to use that as your new one for all the tests?
Absolutely. So you're going to see a couple things coming from us. Right now, we already do have an API. You can. We've actually documented it, so you have the ability to go ahead and execute based on your desires, your timing, your scheduling. You can extract the data as well, as I kind of alluded to earlier. But one of the things that we're going to be doing in the next 3 months is decoupling the task runner from our infrastructure. So it's going to have its own REST API adapter, which you can start invoking from Citrix Cloud if you want to, from Microsoft Endpoint Manager if you wanted to, from Terraform if you wanted to. Doesn't matter. Whatever you're using from an orchestration and scheduling standpoint, you'll have the ability to completely have that even without the Rimo3 infrastructure to orchestrate it.
Nice. And is getting, I think this is a rephrase of the old question, but is data backup possible? Where all these jobs are scheduled. You kind of talked about the difference of using Rimo3 in the cloud versus on-prem. If they're on-prem, do they have, how do they back things up?
That's a good question. I've never had that before. So I mean, the database, yeah, that's backed up, but the jobs that have already been scheduled through a third party, I don't know. I'll have to look into that.
Sounds good. I'll forward that one to Josh, and you can take that offline.
Okay.
The install mechanism, the silent install mechanism we talked about for the MSI is, every organization has those weird one-off apps that, maybe there's a missing parameter for, it just doesn't work, and they might need to use some sort of alternate mechanism. Are MSI parameters or, switch parameters the only thing that could be utilized for the silent installs?
They are not. So if you've decided to do, like I use an example of PowerShell deploy, a lot of people that have missing parameters around MSIs or AppV, you have the ability to use any technology that you want to wrap it and silently install it. In fact, we've had to do that a couple times, and in fact, inside the UI, I can quickly show you. I mean, you have the ability to make the customizations directly inside of the UI in the package detail screen as well around installation instructions. So we give you guidance around 6 or 7 commonly mistaken switches, and we say, would you like to replace them with the best practices or leading practices? You could say, yeah. Then it goes ahead and says, okay, we're going to do a /QN here. We're going to do whatever for your switches for your package, even if the installation instructions are incomplete.
Awesome. Looks like that was the last one on my end. If another one pops up, I'll let you know.
Stop sharing, right? Yeah, okay. So if there are any questions, feel free to visit the website. We've got a bunch of our videos up there. We've got demo videos on the YouTube Rimo3 channel, and you have access to tons and tons of great content, super nerdy content that myself, Josh, and Jeff, and some of the team have spent quite a bit of time creating. As you can tell, this is an area we're quite passionate about by digging around on the website. But if you do want a live demo, if you just go to, I think I put it up there a little bit earlier, but if you go to sales@rimo3.com, I'll put you in touch with someone from the team, and we can get a demo environment set up for you so you can come in, kick it around yourself, get Josh's expertise, who leads our customer success team, and actually get your applications tested to see whether or not they can be migrated.
Thanks, Simi. We do have 2 more that just came in last second here. One is, are there any limitations on the installer types?
As long as it's Windows application and as long as it's silent.
And just so you can explain this one, the Rimo3 he's asking if Rimo3 can only be used to monitor physical workloads that they have on-prem.
Nope. Cloud-based as well. Again, it's not necessarily monitoring. It's more along the lines of executing the application, collecting I mean, think of it as a data collection thing, and it can work on physical devices. It can work on virtual devices and cloud-based.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Well, Stephanie and the rest of the team, I really appreciate being able to come out here. I know everybody is zoomed out. I know everyone's webinared out. I'm no exception to this, so it does mean a lot that everyone stayed on board, and hopefully this was engaging and entertaining, at least, if not knowledgeable.
I think so. Thank you so much for being with us today. I know some of you may have opted in for a chance to win the $100 Amazon gift card. It's a great time of year to get it after you've been probably paying some holiday bills. But I will pull the full attendee report after I close everything out today, and I will pick a random winner. I use the Google number randomizer. So be on the lookout for an email from me, or watch us on Twitter at myCUGC to see who won. And with that, I think I can give you all back to the rest of your day. Thanks so much, Samit. It was nice to have you with us today.
Thanks for having me. This was a blast.
And thank you, Steve. Glad to have you back on the webinar looking at those questions for us.
Thank you. It was great.
All right, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and stay happy, healthy, and safe. And we will see you at another CUGC event here again soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.